Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and welcome to this week's episode. And thank you so much for listening. Clay, do you want to tell them who we talked to this week?
It was so cool. So this is kind of like its own little mystery. So David Nicandri texts me a couple of weeks ago and says, "Hey, you know who Vardis Fisher is, don't you?" Well, of course. Vardis Fisher wrote a book that's really amazingly influential. It's not even a good book, but he wrote a book in 1962 called Suicide or Murder, The Strange Death of Meriwether Lewis. And it changed the whole world of Lewis and Clark studies because he normalized the idea that it might have been murder. And so suddenly everyone starts down that path. And today we still are fighting the murder theory off, even though there's no evidence for it, because Fisher, at a very important time in the Lewis and Clark world, sort of seeded this idea, and it's sort of rattles around the Lewis and Clark world to this moment. And so Nicandri said there's this young woman named HannaLore Hein, and she's apparently the state historian of Idaho. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. And I said, no, I didn't even know there were state historians. And she said, contact her. And he said, I'm going to send you her newsletter, because in their newsletter, she writes about Vardis Fisher. And I said, well, that's interesting. What does she say about him? And he said, well, among other things, he committed suicide. Anyway, strange. And it's sad, very sad. And so I contacted her, and then it turned out, when I looked her up, as you did, she was a student of the great Patricia Limerick, who's one of my favorite people in the world. We're dear friends, and so we're off and running. We're friends now. And she agreed to come on. And we did this today on Zoom for the first time. You and I have known each other so long that we can hear each other's subtext.
Yeah, we haven't seen each other for months.
But now we did this on Zoom, and there she was. She's
that's all right. You haven't changed a bit.
In her late 20s or 30s or something, and she was terrific. And we talked about this book and talked about the irony of Vardis Fisher taking his own life in 1968.
Yeah, she's just delightful. What a bright young woman, and obviously, and I said in the show, I envy her. What a great job, and you can tell how passionate she is about it.
When I first met HannaLore, I said, Idaho is underrepresented in the Lewis and Clark world. You know, Montana gets a gigantic market share, and so does Oregon, right. Washington, but Idaho is sort of. We need more. We need more accounts of Idaho. And I said, one of my goals is to generate new scholarship, to find new people to write about the Lewis and Clark world. We need new insights. And so she's now going to scour her state and try to encourage new scholars to take a look at Lewis and Clark. And she's very interested, as she said, in place, in spirit of place, not just that they did such and such and such and such on a certain day, but it was in this spot. And what does that environment say about their experience? And she's deeply committed also to bringing Native American voices into the story, including by way of oral traditions.
We should go to the show. Before we do, I want to tell everybody thank you so much for your continued support of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. And we so appreciate it, and we need it. And if you're interested in supporting the Jefferson Hour, go to jeffersonhour.com. It's a great website, very deep. There's a lot of stuff there. We're real proud of it. And if you do decide that you'd like to support the show, click on the donate button. There's a number of options. And as I said before, we really appreciate it. And we do so appreciate you taking the time to listen. And Clay?
As to my own Hamiltonian life, the winter encampments, there's still room for the second of the two J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Making of the Atomic Bomb retreat. That sounds technical or dreary. It's not. It's fascinating. He's a tragic character, straight out of Greek tragedy. Excellent. And then the two tours next summer. So the January retreat at Lochsaw Lodge on the Lewis and Clark Trail in Idaho is 24th to 28th January. And then in the summer, we're doing the Lewis and Clark trip, as we always do, but we're also doing a second one on the River of No Return, the Salmon, a raft trip, a Class 4 raft trip. It'll be Lewis and Clark and conservationists in American history and literature. Let's go to the show. Thanks, everyone. Keep listening and tell everyone you know.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson and American history. This week, we are joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and a very special guest, HannaLore. And Clay, would you like to introduce her, sir?
Hello, everyone. This is going to be so much fun because my friend David Nicandri, who is our West Coast Enlightenment correspondent for the Jefferson Hour, called my attention to the fact that HannaLore is now the state historian of Idaho, and in a newsletter wrote a piece about a man named Vardis Fisher. And anyone who knows the world of Lewis and Clark knows who Vardis Fisher is. He was a really prolific Idaho historian, and one of his many, many, many books is called Suicide or Murder: The Strange Death of Governor Meriwether Lewis. And this book had a huge impact on Lewis and Clark studies. It was published in 1962, and he really called attention to the fact that Lewis's death on October 11th, 1809, near Nashville, Tennessee, is not definitively understood, that there are mysteries about it, and there is reason to wonder whether it was suicide, as both Jefferson and William Clark concluded. Possibly it was murder, because the Natchez Trace was notorious for bandits and ruffians and so on. And so he really posited that it was much more likely to be murder than suicide, and that has caused a ripple effect in Lewis and Clark studies that continues, as you know, David, to this day. And so I thought we would go to the Idaho state historian and find out more. So welcome, HannaLore.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Now, I also know, because one of my dearest friends in the world is Patricia Limerick of the Center of the American West, and you studied with her, and now you're a board member of the center.
I am. It was a remarkable experience, and the fact that I was in the right place at the right time and crossed her path is something that I'm relishing and still thankful for today.
And what did you study under her, with her?
So I was doing a program at the University of Colorado Boulder focusing on history and ethnic studies. And I did go through the Center of the American West's certificate program. So I came out not only with my bachelor's degree, but with a certificate in Western American Studies.
And for those who don't know David, Patricia Limerick is a colossal figure in Western studies. She wrote a book that rocked the world of the studies of the American West called Legacy of Conquest. She has spoken everywhere. I mean, there is no Western institution. There's hardly any historical institution.
Well, anyone who's listened to the Jefferson Hour knows about her. You've spoken about her often.
She's a good friend. She's a strange, whimsical genius, wouldn't you say, HannaLore?
I would agree with that wholeheartedly.
And so she's a bit of an acquired taste, but I have never heard her lecture when the payoff wasn't worth every bit of whatever whimsy you were trying to sort out. And so I really have great respect for you, having had that chance to learn under a MacArthur Fellow, one of the nation's geniuses.
Yeah, and I recognize that not everybody has a chance to sit in on her classes or to be able to email her and reach out to her for questions or comments on things. And so I feel very, very fortunate that she is in my life.
How does one become the state historian of Idaho?
Well, considering that I'm the fifth person to hold this position, I think a lot of it has to do with, again, being in the right place at the right time. The person who was state historian before me, Keith Peterson, held the role for more than 20 years. Mm. And the men who came before him also had incredibly long tenures in the position. The longest of whom was Merle Wells. He was the first Idaho state historian, and he came into the position in 1956 and held it for 30 years. But I think my experience in working with the Center of the American West and in studying with Patty and in looking at public history kind of through a different lens and trying to really connect with public audiences, but maintaining that, high level of rigor and academic excellence, put me in a position to have the experience and the background to really fill this role.
What does a state historian do?
So my role is quite broad. I have quite a few responsibilities on my plate. The top and I think most important of which has to do with how I support state government. So, of course, here at the Idaho State Historical Society, we are a component of state government. We have been since 1907, and I take that role very seriously. But I also support other activities and initiatives that happen here within the agency, everything ranging from interpretive analysis for exhibits and the like to trying to manage our publications program, which has kind of been in a hiatus for the last 10 years or so.
So let's say that I'm an Idaho legislator and I'm interested in that thing that happened in Rigby in 1922. I contact you and you go to work on it.
Absolutely. Or if there's a question about how a piece of legislation has changed or not changed over time, or what it looked like when they were debating it, 50 years ago, or if the topic has come up in the past. I mean, those are ways that they can absolutely reach out to me. Over the past summer, I actually worked on a project for the governor and his staff in creating a context paper on how Idaho as a state responded to the Spanish flu in 1918.
And in a nutshell, how did it respond?
It responded much like other states. They had a state level policy entity that tried to enact, policy and create direction. And then the expectation was that the counties would be able to pick it up and take action. But of course, they didn't have the funding. And so it was a challenge. And it was different across the state, depending on what county you lived in.
That's really interesting. There are a lot of parallels between then and now, are there not?
Yes, there are. And the argument that I kind of made throughout that context paper was really looking at how our systems and the institutions and infrastructure that we have in place today are a direct result of legislation that was passed in 1907.
I've seen all of these pictures, a lot of them from the National Archives, of people in 1918 wearing masks and signs, and cities that tried to keep outsiders from entering, and we can learn from this.
Yes, we can. And if every state had a state historian, I think we would be in a better place to make sure everyone had the context. But I am certainly trying to do my part here in Idaho.
Talking to HannaLore Hein, who is the state historian of the state of Idaho. And we're going to talk a little bit about Vardis Fisher and Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark spent some time in Idaho, as you know. Every year I take a group on the Low Trail west of Missoula, and we go all the way to about Orofino, where they built their canoes so they could begin to float downstream for a change. And one member of the expedition is buried on the Idaho-Oregon border, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Tell us about that.
Well, Clay, I'm going to let you kind of give some more background and context on this topic in particular, because I know that you quite truly are the expert on Lewis and Clark.
Very, very nice. He's buried down near Caldwell and Homedale, and he was on his way to the goldfields of Montana in the 1860s when he happened to die right there in the Great Basin on the border of Idaho and Oregon. His grave was untended for a very long time, but during the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition, volunteers came forward and they made it a rather extraordinary place. I've been there a couple of times. It's sort of a haunted place in the middle of nowhere. Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau was the infant that was carried by Sacagawea all the way across the continent and back again. In fact, she breastfed the baby during the whole time. Must have been some challenge for her not only to survive in this company of 30-some young men with all the dangers that they went through, but also taking care of that child and breastfeeding it. So he became a kind of Woodstock baby and was a celebrity guide in the American West and wound up dying there. On to Vardis Fisher. Who is Vardis Fisher and why do we care?
So Vardis Fisher is an Idaho author, born and raised, and he lived the majority of his life here in the Gem State. I think that he matters in part because of how prolific he was throughout his career. I mean, he wrote nearly 40 books. He spanned the genres of fiction and nonfiction and poetry, and he wrote a number of plays in his really early years. And yet his name is not one that comes to mind, when people think about famous authors from Idaho. The names that normally come to mind are Ernest Hemingway or Ezra Pound, or maybe if you're knowledgeable about Western literature, Mary Halleck Foote for her role in really shedding light on women's experiences in the American West. But Vardis Fisher is not well remembered.
His dates are 1895 to 1968. He wrote this immense 12-volume saga, this historical novel called The Testament of Man, which I think takes humans from ancient Iraq all the way. Has anyone ever read it?
Well, the Idaho State Archives does have a full copy of all 12 volumes. I have to say that is not one of the books that I read in preparation for today's call, but the legacy, I think, of those books really shows how voracious he was in his writing and how he could stick on a topic and follow it from start to finish. And I think His approach to writing and his approach to research is, kind of in his own style. But I think that piece in particular really shows how interested he was in how characters and how the human psyche and the human experience developed throughout history.
12 volumes, The Testament of Man, 1943 to 1960. I think it would be cool if you had a scholarship for anyone who actually read all 12. They would get like a full ride to Boise State or a full ride to the University of Idaho. That's a lot of prose. He also, his first novel was called Children of God, which was a historical novel based on the early Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so he has a very interesting history with the LDS Church, too.
Yeah, and I would say, I don't believe that The Children of God was actually his first novel. He had a series of smaller pieces that came out in the early to mid 1920s, the Antelope Hills novels that really chronicled the experiences of pioneers in eastern Idaho and the challenges and the harshness of that landscape, and looking at it kind of through a naturalist's lens of incredibly, realistic, on-the-ground experiences that were also, in a sense, autobiographical. His experience along the Snake River bottoms in a landscape where his nearest neighbor was across the river, and beyond that, it was a 10-mile journey to reach anybody outside of his immediate family, shows that he really took his experiences in Idaho and his upbringing into all of his work. It was a factor in all of his work.
We need to take a short break from this conversation. We're speaking this week with HannaLore Hein, a historian with the Idaho State Historical Society. And we'll return to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. And this week, we're so pleased to have HannaLore Hein, a historian with the Idaho State Historical Society, joining us for the conversation. And you talked in the first segment about her work on the death of Meriwether Lewis. Now, I thought you settled all that with your book, Clay.
Well, no, let me back up. So Nicandri, the great Nicandri, sent me a scan of your Idaho newsletter. I think you're reviving some of these publications after a long hiatus. And there was an article about Vardis Fisher. And, I think you will agree, he's, at least in my part of the world, he's a largely forgotten figure, and he shouldn't be. And so tell us about why you wrote that newsletter piece.
Well, I wrote this newsletter in part because of the need, I think, to really look at literature and look at novelists and look at writers through a historical lens. Yes, there are plenty of brand new books that we can go and pick off the shelf and enjoy. But there are novels that have been written over time that still have relevance to what we are looking at today, and that can still kind of explain things about the world. So Vardis Fisher, considering that he produced both fiction and nonfiction, is a writer that I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into. And he also, again, experienced nearly his entire life here in Idaho, aside from a handful of years where he was teaching elsewhere or when he was traveling the world doing research using his own methods. And I think that that's incredibly important to shine light on folks who were born and raised and who died here.
So let's go to the book. This is one of his pieces of nonfiction. 1962, Suicide or Murder, The Strange Death of Governor Meriwether Lewis. I know you've read it. Why do you think he wrote this book, HannaLore?
I get the sense from having looked at some of his papers that are in the collections at the Boise State University archives, and in reading other pieces that scholars and historians have written about him, that he really had an innate interest in the experiences of the mountain men of the American West. It was a genre and a period in time that he kind of had a natural affinity towards and a natural interest in. And again, I think that goes back to his experiences growing up in a very similar environment. If you look at this book, which is the nonfiction side of his Lewis and Clark work, there's a fiction piece that kind of goes along with it called A Tale of Valor. That is a fictional rendition of the Lewis and Clark journey. And I think that he wrote from both sides on this topic, in part because he was Vardis Fisher and he was going to do what he wanted to do. And he thought that he could do a lot of this work maybe better than others. And his approach to research and his approach to looking at historical sources may not have been what scholars at the time did. There were definitely differences in approach, but he was so interested in the subject and he was so interested in the character of Lewis. I think there were ties back to his father, and I think he saw some characteristics of Meriwether Lewis in his father, and I think he wanted to grapple with that in the best way that he could, which was putting words on paper.
Meriwether Lewis was born in 1774 in Virginia. He became Jefferson's private secretary in the White House. Jefferson trained him and then sent him into the American West between 1803 and 1806. Lewis, as everyone knows, chose William Clark to be his co-commander. They put together a group of about 50, but later down to a permanent party of 33, and they crossed the continent together and spent a significant amount of time in what's now Idaho. In fact, maybe their most successful relations with native peoples were with the Nez Perce, whom they met on the outbound journey and for a longer interlude on the way back. Lewis came back. President Jefferson created a very generous compensation package through Congress for everybody, and he named Lewis to be the governor of Upper Louisiana. Lewis was delayed in getting out there. Nobody quite knows why. He had a kind of difficult, maybe failed governorship in St. Louis, and he was on his way back to Washington to contest some vouchers and financial problems with the War Department in October of 1809, when he died of a gunshot wound to the head and another one to the abdomen at a lonely little inn on the Natchez Trace in Tennessee. And when Clark and Jefferson heard the news, they both concluded that it was suicide. They were saddened and upset, but they weren't really shocked because they somehow sensed that this is who Meriwether Lewis was. So pick it up from there, HannaLore. Vardis Fisher was aware of this story, and he did not like the conclusion that it had been suicide.
He didn't necessarily like that conclusion, but I think more than that, he wanted to provide a lens into how historical research could, in a sense, muddy the waters on this one, I think. His approach to research, like I've kind of alluded to thus far, was not standard. He would look at sources and he would look at materials and kind of take of them what he thought was most important and disregard the rest and maybe not mention it, or take pieces of it and maybe forget he was writing nonfiction and bring some fictional storytelling into some of the mix. So I think on this piece, again, given his interest in the topic and his approach to research, he attempted to lay out an argument both for and against something while ultimately trying to steer the reader towards his view, which was that Lewis was murdered and that he did not commit suicide.
Fair enough. And there's a more recent book, which I played a role in, called By His Own Hand, The Mysterious Death of Meriwether Lewis, which was edited by John Geiss with contributions by me, James Holmberg, and J.H. Buckley, which is a more recent attempt to make sense of all this. HannaLore, you said that he was a bit of an eccentric as a historian, but not so much as we might think. Back at that time, historians had a more saga-based idea of history, that there was a lot of imaginative material in their work, and it wasn't necessarily considered to be unrigorous, especially in treatments of the American West. It wasn't as odd as it might seem.
I would agree with that, but I still think that even within that era of telling more narrative stories and not being as reliant on footnotes, let's say, there was still, even within the field, some trepidation as to his approach. I actually have a quote from the director of the Utah Federal Writers Project from 1939, where he says, this gentleman's name was Maurice Howe, and he says, "Fisher is a swell guy, but erratic, emotional, and not a careful historian." So again, even during his lifetime and during one of his most visible jobs as the Idaho director of the Federal Writers Project, he still had critics out there looking at his approach and saying, we're not sure if we can always trust his research.
And just for our listeners, Vardis Fisher was the director for the WPA Idaho Guide Project, which was published in 1937. Every state got one. And I don't know how well that one holds up. The North Dakota one is a little iffy. It's a great classic, but no one would consult it today without doing some double checking on certain of the facts and so on.
I would say that Idaho's Guide falls into that same category of take it with a grain of salt. There are definitely there's language within it that is prejudicial and could be viewed as racist and whatnot. But even within that project, I mean, he did extensive research and his letters indicate that he was working sometimes 15, 16 hours a day during that 4-year period of his life from 1935 to 1939.
And generally speaking, the WPA guides are a national treasure, even when they're somewhat erroneous. Back to Lewis and Clark. So I know you're not a Lewis and Clark scholar per se, but if you're the Idaho State historian, you're inevitably a Lewis and Clark scholar. You read this book. What was your experience in reading Suicide or Murder?
Well, I have to say that in reading this, I fall on the side of not being a fan of Vardis Fisher. I think the premise was quite interesting, but I think that there were many flaws in his approach. And as I went through it, just for those listeners who are not familiar with the text, it really reads as though each chapter is building on itself and that you have to really get through the whole book to understand what he's trying to say. And that, of course, is an approach that writers can take. It's not one that I would write. I like to make sure each chapter has a point and has a conclusion. But throughout the piece, he relies quite heavily on rewritten letters or rewritten newspaper clippings or what I would consider hearsay in a lot of instances, where it's a retelling of a retelling of a retelling of a story that was told once. And then the retelling the next time was retold differently. And by the middle of the book, I was personally having quite a challenge in keeping up with who said what and who said it when and what side of the argument did it support. So that was my experience with it.
It's a brief, Suicide or Murder. He doesn't say in the title, it was murder, darn it, and nobody else, he does try to sort of weigh the evidence to a certain degree. We know where he's headed because he shows his prejudice pretty early on in the book. When you came away, what did you think going in before you knew this? What was your assumption about Lewis's death? Did it change in any way by reading this study?
Well, my assumption going in, again, having been a student of the American West and being somewhat familiar with this story, was that the scholars who have produced recent scholarship on this topic, including yourself, have produced a fairly solid and solid consensus on the fact that it was suicide. And going into it, having known what I did know about Vardis Fisher, I expected there to be a lot of detail and a lot of information presented. What I was not as maybe prepared for was how convoluted it became by the end.
Well, we're not exactly selling copies of this book. David, you know that this is like a minefield because David and I have known each other for a long time. I've been to these Lewis and Clark annual meetings, and there might be 400 Lewis and Clark lovers in the meeting, and 380 of them want it to be murder even now. I mean, it's not as if this is settled once and for all. Stephen Ambrose said it was suicide. I've said it was suicide. Nicandria said it was suicide. Gary Moulton said it was suicide. Almost everybody who looks at this says it's clearly suicide. But there's a romantic desire for it to have been murder. And David, you're very well aware of all this.
I have not read the book. I have read the beginning of it. And if I might, from the introduction, he writes, "No book and no essay heretofore published has presented more than a part and usually no more than a small part of the available evidence." He goes on and says, "On reading the evidence presented here, the reader may think it was murder, or he may think it was suicide, or he may feel that an unprejudiced mind can come to no conclusion either way." So I kind of get, HannaLore, what you're talking about with his writing style.
And I think, too, throughout here, throughout the text, he uses language that I think, again, falls back into the category of fiction, where he says, assumingly, you know, I feel like every other page he was assuming something, or, uh, other language, unquestionably.
Well, historians have to do that to a certain extent, don't they? I mean, all historians are relying on records left by others. That's Clay and I've had this discussion, and I'm such a fan of firsthand personal accounts, poorly written or not. But in this case, you're saying he's quite a bit away from that.
Yeah, I think he took it to the next level. And had he pulled back a little bit on that front, the arguments would likely have been clearer, or they might not have been. And then that would have been okay too. But I think it was just too much of a literary tactic to employ that kind of language that took away from his overall argument and success.
Thinking about this, somebody who's just walking into this conversation and hasn't had the opportunity to hear all the discussions that Clay has provided on this subject. You wrote a book on this, Clay, and I think you should just take a moment and explain again to listeners the premise of your book and maybe the background for why you came to the conclusion that you did.
My book is called The Character of Meriwether Lewis, Explorer in the Wilderness. I do believe that he committed suicide. I think the evidence is overwhelming that he committed suicide. But we don't know for sure. We simply don't know for sure. He could have been murdered. There are problems with the story. There was no eyewitness, for example. People say, how can you shoot yourself in the skull and in the abdomen? There are many things about this that just are hard to absorb for us. And so you can never say definitively, this is true and that is not true. And so that's an opening. And where there's an opening, people will flow in with their own theories and their own concerns. And Americans don't like suicide in their heroes. We want our heroes to be like Clark, come back and have a good life and have a family and be prosperous and die in bed at a ripe old age. And here's Lewis, who's a national hero. He's Neil Armstrong. And he comes back, and 3 years later, he's dead, and probably by his own hand. So I am agnostic about this, because no historian can say this is absolutely the truth, that it was suicide. But I think it was suicide. And so my book is an attempt to explore his character. And it really started in two ways. One was Stephen Ambrose, and we were good friends. And I once asked him, did anything happen out there on the journey that destabilized Lewis and maybe led to suicide several years later? And he said, absolutely not. These are unrelated. I didn't think that was true. And then I talked to another historian, and I said, what is it about Meriwether Lewis? And he's kind of a philosopher in addition to being a historian. And he said, a sentence that changed my life. He said, how far can you go out there and still come back? And of course, you live in the out there. You live where this all happened. David Nicandri says it was on the return journey in that sector between Fort Clatsop and Missoula where Lewis came undone. And he was having a slow motion nervous breakdown at that time. And so my book is an attempt to try to explore the character of Lewis on the assumption that his character was already unstable before and during the trip, and to see this as a simple something that happened a couple of years later is just wrong-headed. So, be that as it may, there is no serious Lewis and Clark scholar who believes in the murder theory, but whenever I hear people speaking absolutely about this, I contest it and say, we just don't know.
Yeah, and I think our role as historians is to do just that. We're not supposed to necessarily be passing judgment or making definitive conclusions on any of this, but we are supposed to be able to look at these historical documents and look at the evidence that is available to us and use our lens and use our training to present the information in a logical way so that folks can pick that up and come to their own conclusions. By the time I got to the end of this book, what I really had wanted to do was to have a digital version of it so that I could kind of do some playing around with the text. And I wanted to pull out anything that was a reprint or a retyping of a letter or a historical document and really look at what Vardis Fisher wrote. What was his assumption? What was his real words? And not only to do that, but then to use the technologies that are available to us today and look at it differently. So my mind immediately went to creating a Esri story map based on this book. And to look at it not necessarily in this approach of I'll give you a little bit in this chapter and then I'll make you wait for the next chapter. I'll make you wait. And then at that point, we can look at it over time and over space in a digital way that may yield new conclusions.
Well, we have to come back to talk about that more. We need to take a little bit of a break here, but I want to ask you more about this mapping, this story mapping. It's fascinating, and it's a new way of looking at problems of American history. So we're listening to our friend HannaLore Hein, the state historian of Idaho, talking about Vardis Fisher, who was a prolific author, and he produced a book in 1962, which is still influential in the Lewis and Clark world, whatever its problems are: Suicide or Murder, the Strange Death of Governor Meriwether Lewis. We'll take a short break. We'll be back in a minute, and I have further questions for the state historian of Idaho. Welcome back, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson. Out of character this week, I'm sitting here with David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, actually sitting across town. We're still practicing social distancing here in the hottest of the hot states, North Dakota. Talking today with HannaLore Hein of the Idaho Historical Society. HannaLore, you said something very intriguing at the end of the second section of this program about using digital resources to map a story like Vardis Fisher's attempt to make sense of the death of Lewis. Give us Story Mapping 101 here. Tell us what's going on.
Of course. So story mapping is a tool that Esri ArcGIS has developed and created, and it's available online. And it essentially allows scholars or scientists or students to take place-based information and augment that with narrative, photographs, audio, video, any sort of components that you may have available to you to help tell a story. And you input some of your place-based information into this system, and then it basically will come out reading like a website, and you can follow it by place or you can follow it through time. You really have a lot of freedom to develop the approach that you want to take, but it allows you to really hone in on where something happened, and it uses Google Earth kind of technology so you can see it on the map, and you get that piece of information with it, and it correlates to place. So, for example, in Fisher's book, he brings up Mrs. Grinder's account and how she told it at one point, and then she retold it, and someone else heard it, and then someone else retold it, and it just kind of went on and on, just following those pieces of evidence through a story map and saying at this point in time, in this exact place, she said it this way. At this exact point in time, and at this exact point in place, she said it this way. That would have been incredibly helpful to recognizing how her story changed, how it didn't, and whether those alterations actually made a difference in the evidence.
So you're charting her different testimony over time graphically.
Yes.
And that helps you to see the evolution of her story spatially, and somehow you're saying that's something you just can't do as easily by typing it all out.
Well, I don't think Fisher did it very well. I mean, maybe other historians could do it better, but in this sense, I mean, even the conversation that he included about geographical locations of the buildings and the outhouses at Grinder's Stand. I mean, I had a real hard time really keeping track of, well, was it 20 feet? Was it 12 feet? Were the children in the outbuilding? Were they in the house? Were they, where was everybody in each chapter?
So I'm the editor of the Lewis and Clark Quarterly. We proceeded on. I'd like to invite you to write an article if you want to continue down this path and show graphically with some slides from the system you're using how this helps sort and clarify, because I think, first of all, our readership, frankly, has never heard of this, and they should. And it might, and I think you're saying it produces clarity and insights that it's not as if you couldn't get them another way, but it's a very good way to visualize historical conundra.
Exactly. And I think it's also an incredibly powerful tool to reach broader audiences. I mean, I don't know of anybody in the general public today who's going to pick up this book and say, I'm so excited to learn whether he committed suicide or whether he was murdered.
Especially not after the account you've given of how convoluted and problematic it is.
I invite anyone to pick it up and maybe contradict me. But again, this was my perspective.
No, you're right, I'm sure.
Folks might be more inclined to go online and spend 5 or 10 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour exploring something that was visually appealing, that provided a sense of logical and chronological development. And, interestingly, I did pull some of the original book reviews of this book that came out in 1962. And in one of them, in the same kind of sentence, they were describing it as an exciting detective story. And then by the end of it, it also explained Fisher as a sort of lawyer, and that this should be used as a tool for future lawyers in terms of laying out a case. So again, maybe this is just the 21st century model of using visuals and using a different technology to lay out your case.
And say again what this visual storytelling program is.
It's called Story Maps by Esri, E-S-R-I.
Let me go back to that last night, and I want you to tell me what you think happened. So Meriwether Lewis is on his way to Washington, D.C. He's going down the Mississippi. He changes his path at what's now Memphis. He gets onto the Natchez Trace. He's about 72 miles from Nashville. He comes to this Airbnb, sort of this shack, Grinder's stand. The husband's away. Mrs. Grinder gives him the room. She vacates the room for him. Pick it up from there. Tell us, in your view, what happened next?
I believe that he shot himself in the stomach and shot himself in the head. I believe that, again, based on the evidence that was presented before that final night, the fact that he knew he was in financial ruin, the fact that he had tried to kind of clean up his affairs before he left, the fact that he was in possession of his most treasured objects and items, his journals, and all of the work that he did on that expedition. He didn't want that to go to the wayside. And I think that he was most likely sick with malaria or not well, given the environmental strain of going through this hot and humid climate.
He had malaria, we know.
And that he ended his life. And I don't think that takes away from his heroism or his place in American history in the slightest.
As you know, the murder theorists say, A, it's a notoriously unsafe place, the Natchez Trace, so that means there could have been a ruffian. B, where's this Mr. Grinder? What's going on? Why is Robert Grinder not around? And C, why are her accounts so different over time? There must be a cover-up going on here. And then there's no eyewitness, but the near eyewitnesses, Pernier, who's Lewis's free black servant, and Neely, who's this somewhat rascally man that he happens to be traveling with, are by no means reliable, etc. As a historian, when you hear that sort of thing, what are the questions you ask of those alternative theories? This
is where I wish Fisher was more of a true historian in today's sense, and that he had footnoted some of these excerpts in his piece. Because just because he's explaining something that someone said or something that someone wrote doesn't mean that he didn't change any of that language.
We can't necessarily trust his transcription, the veracity of his documents, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think, any historian would want to look at that source material to see how he came to that conclusion. And, from my experience, that's kind of the science side of history. And that's what I loved so much about it, is the method. And again, without having those materials at hand, I wouldn't want to make a conclusion as to whether the murder theory is believable or even plausible. But what I did come away from this book thinking is that I am not nearly as well versed in this particular piece of American history as I should be, especially given my role. But I would like to dig into this more, and I think that there there are amazing opportunities for young scholars such as myself and other contemporaries of yours, Clay, to continue this conversation and to place it maybe within a different context.
So, in your opinion, you're young and you are part of a really a fresher way of looking at American history with less white triumphalism. Let's put it that way. How do we reinvigorate interest in the Lewis and Clark story to new generations, do you think?
Well, I think that you have to go back to look at it from a place-based perspective, and that this, again, would be an amazing opportunity to tell more of a story of Native experience and tribal experience in the regions through which they passed, and not just have it be a singular story of Sacagawea and her experiences as a Limhi Shoshone woman, having lived in a Mandan camp, and then essentially helped 33 men survive for nearly 2 years. I think that the tribal piece needs to be explored more, and I think that those tribal partners need to be brought in to help tell that story. And I'd love to see tribal scholars take lead on that.
Well, we've done a little bit. So when I was the editor of the Dakota Institute Press, we published the book by Alan Pinkham and Steve Evans, Lewis and Clark Among the Nez Perce, which is a really interesting book that they're trying to re-edit now for republication. And so I was hoping that would be the beginning of Lewis and Clark Among the Mandan, Lewis and Clark Among the Lakota, Lewis and Clark Among the Clatsop. So far, it hasn't happened. But Idaho continues, as you know, to have a big market share in the Lewis and Clark world. So are you able, as a state historian, to work with young people in the K through 12 world and with college students to try to encourage this sort of place-based, more multicultural scholarship?
I certainly hope so. I know within the Idaho State Historical Society, our biggest connection to the K through 12 education is through National History Day. And this coming year, the National History Day kind of big theme is communication. And one of the topics that I posed to our National History Day coordinators was looking at the kind of death of native languages throughout the West. And death isn't the right word, because there are lots of efforts on many reservations and within many tribal communities to reinvigorate their language programs. But I mean, that's one topic where I could see there being efforts made to bring multiculturalism and bring a new view through the K through 12 component of it. I also am very fortunate as the state historian to have some pretty amazing contacts at universities throughout the state. And so any way that I can support that, those faculty in their work, and to help bring up the next generation of scholars who are not just interested in Lewis and Clark studies, but who are interested in Idaho history, that is absolutely something that I would like to see happen over the course of my career. We've got amazing resources here at the Idaho State Archives, and for any student at Boise State University, at least, that's within a 5-mile radius of campus. And I'm hoping that within the office of the state historian here at the Idaho State Historical Society, that I can develop an internship program that will be ongoing, that will help develop research skills, analytical skills, critical thinking skills, but also that public outreach and engagement component. It's incredibly important for our field.
HannaLore, you may not know this because you're just meeting David Swenson, but he has been doing very important work with language restoration with the Lakota. Just say a little bit about that, David.
Well, I have. I've worked with some really dedicated individuals from the Lakota Language Institute, as well as tribal members from Standing Rock. And a big part of what they do is to teach young people on the reservation the language, to get them to speak it. One of the projects we did that was really fun was to translate, I think it was about 24 episodes of a cartoon called the Berenstein Bears into Lakota language to teach young children how to speak it. And it was great fun. We'd have a couple dozen tribal members here at a time, ranging in age from children to elders, speaking different parts. One of the things, though, that I wanted to bring up was, to this day, especially in the 3 affiliated tribes, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, there are oral histories of the time of Lewis and Clark. They talk about this man with the red hair who would share gifts with everyone, and another man with dark skin who looked like a buffalo. But I want to come back to you, Lori Hein, and I am so envious of what you get to do. You must just really enjoy your job.
So I feel incredibly fortunate that I am in the role of Idaho State Historian, and knowing that the predecessors, who came before me have left an incredibly rich legacy of work. And the previous state historian, Keith Peterson, is serving as a mentor to me. So I feel supported, I feel appreciated, and I'm just incredibly eager to see how my work can help support the Idaho State Historical Society in preserving and promoting Idaho history, for as many years as I am here.
There is one thing that comes up in the book early on. Fisher says that Jefferson didn't really know much about Meriwether Lewis's life, in particular his early years. From what I've heard from you, Clay, I've always been under the impression that he knew all about Meriwether Lewis from an early time.
I don't know quite the context of that, but Jefferson was a neighbor of the Lewises. Lewis grew up within sight of Monticello. His mother, Lucy Marks, provided turkeys and hams for Monticello. Jefferson knew Lewis's father. It's hard to believe he didn't know a fair amount about young Meriwether Lewis, and he wrote about him in 1813 for the first edition of the journals, and he speaks with some authority. Now, he did some checking with family members before he wrote that, so we simply don't know. I will say this about Jefferson, that one thing that really struck me the first time I read this book is that Vardis Fisher says Jefferson can't be relied on in talking about this story, because after all,
Right.
When he was in Paris, he had an affair with a married woman. And so a guy who would have an affair with a married woman can't be a good judge of his protege's suicide. You think this goes back to what HannaLore was saying. If this is your historical methodology, we're in some trouble here, don't you think?
I would agree.
So let me ask you this question. We're going to run out of time. We're so glad that we're talking with HannaLore Hein. Let's go to the unfortunate question of suicide. Now, the most famous literary suicide in the history of Idaho is Hemingway. I think he died in 1963, so just about the time that Vardis Fisher was writing this book. One thing that struck me, and one reason that David Nicandri contacted me about you, was that you note in your newsletter that Fisher himself committed suicide. So how does that fit, if at all, into this story?
Well, I think it does fit, and I think there are definitely parallels and correlations that I think we can draw from Fisher's life and death to that of Lewis and his death. In some of the newspaper reports that came out after his death, and I think this is where the correlations actually exist, and we can see them and say, yes, that is ironic, or that is interesting. The newspapers misreported his death in a lot of the same ways that they maybe misreported Lewis's. For example, I have a quote from the Idaho Statesman that says that he had been taken and suddenly stricken and then taken to an ambulance where he died. His widow said that that wasn't true, that he had died on site. And then the hospital records don't exist as to when he arrived. And the funeral home doesn't seem to have record of the cremation. And so here we have, again, a apparent suicide. It may be suicide or accident, might have been the book we could write about him instead of suicide and murder. But there were definitely discrepancies about how his death was reported to the public.
Fascinating. It's really fascinating. And thank you for that. That really deepens this story. You really have brought a wonderful moment to this discussion, and we so very much appreciate it. We'll see you all next week for another important issue of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.